Good evening, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank, and today we're adumbrating the first half of Chapter 37, The Stormy 60s, or if you're using the 15th edition or older, Chapter 38. Anyway, let's get started.
Alright, the 60s were an eventful decade with the Civil Rights Movement, the emergence of a youth culture, and the Vietnam War. Remember that Kennedy was elected in 1960, and he chose many young Harvard graduates for his cabinet. Kennedy also promised a new frontier, or he promised to improve healthcare and education in addition to instituting an army of young American volunteers to aid other undeveloped countries. This army was called the Peace Corps. Now, Frank, how did Kennedy enact the new frontier on the American home front?
Well, Kennedy's first political move was expanding the House Rules Committee, which opened more slots for Democrats and cleared the way for reform legislation. Next, Kennedy negotiated a deal with the steel industry to keep wages from spiking in an attempt to control inflation. However, when the businessmen tried to double-cross him, he, quote, called the big steel men to the Oval Office and unleashed his Irish temper. The corporations then backed down. The next item on Kennedy's list was using the new frontier to explore the final frontier. And in 1962, he asserted that America would be the first nation to land a man on the moon. 7 years later, in 1968, the Apollo program successfully did just that. Abe, so far we've talked a lot about what the US did domestically, but what was happening inside Eastern Europe?
Well, in Mother Russia, Kennedy met with Soviet leader Khrushchev, and Khrushchev threatened to block Western access to Berlin. Khrushchev kept his word and began construction on the Berlin Wall, or a colossal concrete barrier that cut off the population drain from east to west Germany. Kennedy focused on Western Europe and supported the European Economic Community, which was a free trade zone in Western Europe. The free trade policies passed at this time began the process of globalization that has continued to grow today. Kennedy did face some resistance with Charles de Gaulle of France, who prohibited the British from gaining common market membership since he feared it could allow America to more strongly control European affairs. Now, Frank, could you describe Kennedy's flexible response policy?
Absolutely. In the wake of World War II, the European powers began to give up their imperial holdings. Now, Laos was a classic example of what happened. As the French forces withdrew, it prompted a communist insurgency. Kennedy was unwilling to use the massive retaliation we learned about in the last chapter, leading to a middle course between too little and too much action, known as flexible response. A flexible response led to the development of America's first special forces, the Green Berets. Essentially, it was a course between total nuclear war and doing nothing, sending in a small armed troop to take action against an aggressor. Abe, what were some of the downsides of this flexible response strategy?
Well, unfortunately, the flexible response policy made it much easier for America to go to war, as evidenced by the developing Vietnam War. Many Vietnamese people threatened the pro-American Vietnamese government under Ngo Dinh Diem. So some American forces first entered Vietnam with the premise of establishing political stability. Ironically, Kennedy later ordered American troops to oust Diem. Kennedy thus contributed to the political chaos in Vietnam. Instead of going to war, some Americans supported a modernization theory in which traditional societies could develop into industrial nations by following the West's path. Among the modernization theorists was Walt Whitman Rostow and his book, The Stages of Economic Growth. Now, Frank, can you take us back to the days of Cuba?
Of course. Kennedy's attempts to stimulate diplomatic ties between the US and South America proved unfruitful. Even worse, his government oversaw the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, in which American-backed anti-communists were slaughtered in their attempt to retake Cuba. The failed operation naturally pushed Cuba into closer ties with the USSR, America's enemy, which began to install nuclear warheads inside Cuba. This led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the times in which nuclear war was a very real probability. Fortunately, the Soviets, led by Khrushchev, backed down, and the crisis ended with some positive effects, such as the first Moscow-Washington telephone line for direct contact. Abe, we've been talking a lot about international politics, but can you shift the attention back towards a more domestic atmosphere for us?
I would love to. Before he was elected, Kennedy pledged to eradicate racial inequality quickly, but in the end, he took his time. He passed some medical and educational bills and claimed that they would eventually help blacks as much as civil rights bills would. Many blacks, however, wanted racial equality immediately, so freedom riders began to drive around America protesting segregation. Kennedy did eventually partner with Martin Luther King Jr., and he began the Voter Educational Project, which registered many blacks to vote in the South. In 1963, MLK began a brutal campaign against racial discrimination in Alabama. MLK and his peaceful marchers were attacked by the police with electric rods and high-pressure water hoses. So Kennedy gave a speech and promised to commit himself to resolving the moral issue of racial discrimination. He also called for more civil rights laws to protect blacks. MLK responded to Kennedy's speech by leading 200,000 people on a peaceful march on Washington to support Kennedy's proposed legislation. At this time, King also gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. In the end, Kennedy's civil rights bill made little progress. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the end of President Kennedy?
Unfortunately, on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was shot while riding through the streets of Dallas. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in to replace him. How was LBJ in terms of his political philosophy?
Well, LBJ's policies echoed those of Franklin D. Roosevelt, his political daddy. Once LBJ became president, he became very liberal, and he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial discrimination in restaurants, movie theaters, hospitals, and more. Interestingly, the act was also the foundation for gender equality, since it passed with a clause that prohibited discrimination on a sexual as well as racial basis. Johnson also called for affirmative action, very important. These were efforts to eliminate gender and racial imbalances in jobs and education. Lastly, Johnson began a billion-dollar war on poverty that was ultimately unsuccessful. The Great Society is the term for all of these New Dealish measures passed under President Johnson. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the election of 1964?
Of course I can. As the election of 1964 rolled around, Senator Barry Goldwater ran as the Republican opposition to Johnson. Goldwater promised to lower the income tax, eviscerate Social Security, and blast civil rights legislation. Johnson and the Democrats made Goldwater into a trigger-happy cowboy, while at the same time seizing upon the Gulf of Tonkin incident to expand military activity in Southeast Asia. Johnson claimed that the Vietnamese forces had attacked American gunboats cruising on the Tonkin Sea. Though the claim was falsified, Johnson used it to receive congressional military approval for a larger war in Vietnam. In the end, Johnson won out, taking 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions.
We'll catch you guys
Next time.